Hello, everyone. Once again, this is your poster child for overactive brain disorder. And as already promised, I am going to be talking about a little theory that I've been working on called the game director theory of God. So, to begin with, I'm going to talk about possible worlds. A possible world is a way that a world could be without creating a logical contradiction in its setup. So, you know, if you could have worlds that are completely different from ours, worlds that are kind of like ours, doesn't really matter. As long as you've got a setup for this is how this world works and it doesn't have logical contradictions, it's a possible world. The world could have possibly been that way. How many are there? Well, way too many to count. Now, even if we limit ourselves to just the worlds with sentient life in it that makes good stories, we still have way too many to count because there are just so many different variables you're playing with. And you tweak one here one way and tweak another way and tweak the third one, etc., etc. You're just getting way too many to count. In this way, it's kind of like multiverse theory, except we don't have to acknowledge that any of them have physical reality. We can have them all being mental constructs. Or maybe we can have one or two be physical, or maybe like all but five or six of them are physical, whatever. It doesn't really matter because we're just talking about what could be existing as a logically possible idea. So we can experience a lot of these possible worlds because all we have to do is just imagine, okay, well, what about a world like this? Well, congratulations, you just created a possible world, and you can experience this, and some of these can provide insights into our own world if they're close enough or have elements we can actually compare. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to begin by choosing a world that is kind of like ours, but it has a few illustrative differences. So the world I'm going to use for our example here is one that's virtually the same as what our world was like around 1900, but with these exceptions. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's works about Sherlock Holmes are history rather than fiction. So in that world, there really was a Sherlock Holmes and a Dr. Watson and all the various characters thereof. Uh, we can also go and project plausible actions, thoughts, and thought processes onto these characters and make them a part of the world. That if, we can imagine, well, what would happen if this person did this, or this person started discussing that, or started thinking about this other thing, and add them into the world too. Uh, and the last thing is that Sherlock Holmes finds and reads copies of Mark Twain's stories about Tom Sawyer, the adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, etc. Finding all of these, and that he actually finds them and reads them. Now, there are certain things that we can assume about this world. We can assume that the people of this possible world can see, hear, and feel what we would see, hear, and feel if we were put into that same sort of situation that we're describing. And we can also assume that the people of this possible world have no special discovery tools beyond what our world would have had at the start of the 20th century. Yeah, no real telescopes into other worlds or other ways of like sensing supernatural like devices that we didn't already have. So, so at this point, we could actually go and create a plausible thought process for what Sherlock Holmes might be thinking after reading some of these books. It's like, look at the characters in this story. Though fictional, the world in which they live is similar enough to ours to enable us to understand their thoughts and lives. They think they live in a completely natural world, with trees and flowers and chirping birds and basket weavers who sit and smile and twiddle their thumbs and toes. No entities outside their world controlling their thoughts, their actions, or their lives would be perceivable to them, and they might reasonably conclude that such entities don't exist. But we know better. We know of Mark Twain, the genius behind the story, who created their entire world by his word, and who controls and sustains it through that same world. If that word were to vanish from our world entirely, so would his world. So if that world could be so controlled without their knowledge, why not our world? Could we not actually make that same conclusion about our own world? All right, so what does this actually show? Well, if we consider the possible worlds of fiction, we can see that at least some possible worlds are created by agents outside of those worlds. These are agents that are not part of the world that they created and would, by that world's standards, have to be considered supernatural. They're not part of that world, they're outside of it, super above the natural world, supernatural. Therefore, some possible worlds are supernaturally created, and many of those worlds are similar to ours. And through that, we can see the similarities offer a possibility that this world is likewise created in a supernatural fashion by a supernatural agent. Now, if there are peculiarities of our world that would preclude said conclusion, they would prevail. But what could anyone point to as to a peculiar nature of our world that would prevent such a conclusion? Well, the most obvious peculiarity that people are going to point out to it in our world is that, hey, our world is real. Those worlds, they're not real. They're just imaginations. Well, remember our beginning setup. The inhabitants of our possible world here that I just set up here, they see, hear, experience their world the same way as we wrote in our world. So the signs that we're pointing to say, hey, our world is real because we can do these things, that inhabitants of that world would be able to make those same kinds of claims. Yeah. They see trees, they touch trees, they gather fruit from trees, they eat fruit from trees, etc. Same as in our world. So why do we see our world as real? Well, obviously because we're living in it. The inhabitants of those worlds are not going to see our world as real because they can't see, hear, feel, touch anything in our world, but they do see their world as real because they can. To them, their world is real, our world's a fantasy. So real, in this case, becomes an indexical term. Basically, as an index thing, basically pointing out a particular world as opposed to, having any meaning beyond that. And it effectively translates to where I live. What world is a real world? Well, what world do you live in? If you live in that world, you consider that world real. If the multiverse is theorized is real, then these other worlds may very well have a physical existence, meaning that any other distinctions that would happen would disappear. Therefore, this objection really doesn't have any impact of the force of the argument because it's just, well, where are you? Are you in this one world or are you in this other world? That really are the same when it comes to the overall scheme of things. Another objection could be that possible worlds, being mental constructs, the only way to communicate them is to basically describe in words what's going on with them. Yeah, here's this world, it does this, it does not do that. So possible worlds are merely words and nothing else. But the Bible has been saying that for a while. Look at the whole story of Genesis 1. Then God said, let there be light. And God said, let there be an expanse. And God said, let the waters below be gathered into one place. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens. And then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind. And God said, let us make man in our image. And then God said, behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed. So it's all, and God said. So, as is pointed out in Psalm 33:6, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all of their host. So, what does this prove? Well, you could say possible worlds are nothing more than words given substance by a mind. In that case, the Bible has been right about what's been going on for thousands of years. It makes this world just one possible world spoken into the existence by the Word of God. And we consider it real because we are in this world. Other worlds made by other words from other people are not real in our existence because we're not in them. Again, so looking at this whole thing, it is not a meaningful objection to the concept. In fact, this basically reinforces the concept. So another possible objection is, hey, where does free will fit into all of this? Now, in the abbreviated scenario that I put up above, this is just a simple version. It gets the point across that we have a case for comparing that the stories that we create are comparable to our life as a grand story with a grand storyteller. Now, that part doesn't get the free will thing across. Some people, that's actually going to be sufficient to demonstrate how God is sovereign over events, and they really don't need to go much beyond that. For others, and myself included, the absence of free will is a problem that really needs to be addressed. Now, I developed this concept not from the static works of literature such as books or plays or anything where you've got an author or a set of authors that are basically laying out a story and that's it. That's all it happens. I developed it from the more dynamic world of role-playing games. Things like Dungeons and Dragons, Torg, Call of Cthulhu, you name it. There's a whole bunch of them, and if you really want to go into that, that's something we can discuss at a later time. But now, let me take the time to present the true formulation of the argument. Now that you have the basic idea of where I'm going with it. So this is the full-on game director theory. First thing is that role-playing worlds are ultimately created and sustained by one or more referees who control the action within that world, which here we would call game directors, hence the game director theory. Although these game directors, there could be one or more for any particular game, although they have final control over what happens in their world, they can and often do pass small amounts of that control to others. Most of this control passes, in this case, to players who, through their player characters, participate in acts and scenes that the game directors speak into existence. While the players have control over most of their characters' actions, game directors have ultimate control, although the best ones only assert that control over a player character in limited circumstances. And the actions outlined here are analogous to how God works through our world, as using our previous model as a basis to understand just how that control might take place. Now, a lot of people are going to have an objection right off the bat, and that it sounds like comparing human actions to God's great actions here. And how can we actually do that? Now, what I'm not doing is I'm not saying, hey, I'm just as big as God and I can do anything I want to in this world, etc., or any game director can do that. It's more of how God acts in this world can be mildly simulated and kind of replicated a little bit when a game director acts on that particular game director's world. So while God has an omnipotence over everything that's in our world and everything that we see here, a game director would have a similar power over their game world in that they can choose for things to happen or not happen as they see fit. And players have the little bit of extra control over their situations, can't override a game director. When it comes to omniscience, the game directors know everything in the game that matters. If it turns out that they don't know something that matters, well, now suddenly they can add something to the game so that they do know what is going on. And impose it at any time. For omnipresence, no action is going to take place without the presence of a game director to make it happen. And the game director can access any place at any time in any circumstance that happens within the context of that game. So, within the context of that game director is omnipresent. And then omnibenevolence. Well, hey, we know that God is working for the good of all of us. But, game directors don't have to. This is one of those things that, gotta admit that as humans, sometimes we get a little bit evil and do things that really shouldn't be done. But the best game directors are ones that are willing to put the best interests of the game and the players and the characters within them at the forefront and do their best to make the game a better position. As for other God's attributes, things like spaceless, timeless, immaterial, eternal things, these are all easily explained. The game directors and the players do not occupy locations within the game world. Now, they may have characters that occupy locations in the game world. The game director can put objects at locations in the game world. Players can interact with the locations in the game world and the objects therein, but ultimately, the people who are directing the game do not occupy any location within that game. Timelessness. There's no restriction on exactly where in the timeline people interact. They interact with a present, which we could define as maybe year 1375 after the arrival of the year star. Or it could be like maybe 500 years before the year star shows up. Or it could be 2 million years after the year star shows up. The year star may have blown up and no longer exist, and you no longer reckon time that way. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Immateriality is the same sort of thing. You don't have, as a game director or as a player operating a player character, you do not actually have a material existence within the game world. Now, some people would say because the game world doesn't have a material existence, but as we pointed out before with our other stuff, that hey, they believe they have a material existence. They operate as if they have a material existence, and within their concept of a material existence, that concept does not include a game director or these other people acting on player characters. Then for eternality of game directors have access to all time, as we said before. The very first thing, the very first person to show up was there. The game director was there for them. At the very end of the game world, the game directors are there. So when God calls himself the first and the last of this world, we can apply the very same sort of thing to the eternality of a game director within the context, very limited, specific context of that game world. I do want to take a little more time responding to the whole blasphemy objection. God has a great, grand, glorious plan that game directors here don't even come close to achieving. God has promised that we who are saved by grace through faith will be with him in the end. Game directors I know aren't even going to promise anything similar to that. Their stories aren't even built for that. They're building a story of, how do these humans or elves or dwarves or whatever handle this particular crisis. They go through, they tell the story, the crisis is over, and either the world ends or another crisis comes up, and these now advanced characters deal with a bigger crisis. One day it may be orcs, another day it may be goblins, another day it may be devils, another day it may be dragons. But even still, uh, game directors use a fraction of the tools, basically copies of the tools of God within their small little world to achieve lesser ends. And in no way is this as powerful as what we see with God. So he is greater than all. To him be the glory, and let everything else fall by the wayside. So the main reason that I keep holding on to this, despite the potential charges of blasphemy, is that it has great explanatory power over a lot of the controversies that seem to stem around religion and how things would work or could work or might work. They all seem to vanish or diminish in importance or disappear or just become easily explainable. I never have to worry about, you know, you know, what is the nature of God? God could be one. I mean, if there's one game director, only one, there's only one person using it, hey, that's great. Now, Trinities, well, hey, that be explained. The one God power is being used by three people who are working together in harmony to a common goal, common will. They all like each other and they're not going to backstab each other. That kind of Trinity could very easily be explainable through this thing. You know, are we determined? Basically, are all our actions completely determined? If we've got our original scenario, you know, the entirety of the book is laid out. The one author writes it. Everything happens. Everyone does their part. They do their stuff. Hey, boom, that's determination. Do we have free will? Well, hey, we look at this as more of a role-playing exercise and less of a book. Then hey, we could have great free will. We could have the the will to do all sorts of things that may not have necessarily been expected as part of the overall scenario, but hey, actually get incorporated in. Yeah. Is there a supernatural realm? Well, in many of our other possible worlds, there are. If we're dealing with a role playing world, there most certainly is a supernatural realm because our game director is running things supernaturally. Hey, why should this world be any different? We could, miracles, theoretically, everything's a miracle in the sense that a game director must prove it and the game master's a supernatural agent. Now, some fools are more evident than others. Basically, some violations of, standard practice, whatever, might be a little more obvious and might be a little bit more significant. Now, these are the sorts of things that I basically see as a reason to hold on to this theory, and unless there's a reason not to, I'm going to keep holding on to it for a while. But anyway, I just want to thank you for watching. I'm your poster child for overactive brain disorder, as you may have already figured out by now, just the way I've been talking about it. But I really do want to thank you for watching, and take care, and I will see you next time.